Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you didn't know, I'm a diagnosed narcissist, but before I say the things I'm going to say in this video, keep in mind that I am not a licensed professional. So with that out of the way, I never really thought I would make another video about stigma, but I've been thinking a lot about my past relationships and oh wow, you can connect two and two together. The narcissist does not necessarily have like, oh, so the best of romantic relationships. And that's why you get all these people online talking about like, oh, their narcissistic ex, their narcissistic ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, whatever, narcissistic husband, wife, and, all that kind of stuff. And, I'm never going to deny the antisocial tendencies that anybody with a cluster B personality disorder can, I guess have the tendency to like inflict on people. But I have been thinking of a bunch of stuff and it like really inspired the creation of this video because, I've been thinking a lot about like the term narcissistic abuse and stuff like that and the failures that I've encountered in my own personal like relationships and stuff. And I'll admit one thing. It is very difficult for me to admit that I have hurt people in, past relationships. And I have, I guess, a tendency to want to like, blame, everything on them. But realistically, apparently, when a relationship fails, probably, or, a lot of people like to say it takes two people to, really break up a relationship. So that's why I said keep in mind, I am not saying obviously that it is unheard of for a narcissistic person or just a cluster B, individual to be such a difficult person to be in a romantic relationship with, or maybe even friendship, just like, any relationship in general, because you can kind of just connect like two and two together between relationships with people that have terrible emotional regulation skills. And that is essentially a cluster B person. In a very simple definition, a cluster B person is somebody that struggles with emotional regulation, and not having the best sense of self or like self identity. So you can kind of see how that's a recipe for disaster when it comes to like, navigating your life and, current experiences and whatnot. But speaking again about stigma and whatnot, and that's why I have a video made a long time ago where I thought I would have like addressed stigma fully, but I think in that video I haven't really, spoken about like certain hypocrisies that I see between people that talk about like narcissistic abuse and whatnot. Or maybe I actually did, because I didn't actually watch that video before I decided to like, film this one. But I've been stirring like some thoughts that I feel like maybe could make that video a little better. Although at least this video is going to be centered more so around like romantic relationships and whatnot. I'm sure I probably spoke about like romantic relationships like, in that video. But I guess to kind of point out the word that I've, had in my mind a lot when it comes to like narcissistic abuse and whatnot is quote unquote like hypocrisy. Because if I remember correctly, I spoke a lot in that video about how like everybody, when they think of like NPD, ASPD, or like cluster B disorders, a lot of people, as with the stigma goes, just want to paint us as like, the big bad wolf and whatnot. And I think it kind of like undermines the, I guess, what a lot of people are like, not necessarily prepared for, even though they say that they are like the most like healthiest of people, at least in comparison to like a narcissist. Because if you talk about a narcissistic relationship, the person that is labeled as the non-narcissist is, obviously the saint, obviously the victim. So this is what I mean when I say that I don't think a lot of people are like, ready to hear this. You can mistreat people with cluster B disorders as well. You can show us just as much disrespect, just as much neglect, or let's say immorality, if I'm being like extremely dramatic about it. So I wanted to expand a little bit about that, in this video. So my train of thought led me to incels. And why incels exactly? Because, oftentimes you'll hear that incels are off-putting to other people because they blame women for all their problems, or they have some sort of like entitlement issue that makes them difficult to be in a relationship with because everything is, all centered around like them and these, crazy, distorted, expectations and whatnot. And along with narcissism and narcissistic abuse, because a lot of this is often about, like, in the context of like romantic relationships, it's interesting to me that a lot of people can rightfully, call out incels for their quote unquote like misogyny and stuff like that. And, their one-sidedness to, all of it, because they see incels as people that are filled with rage and filled with like a lot of like hate towards women and stuff. But in a way, if you have problems and issues with your ex to the point where you can't get over it, a lot of people will, characterize incels as, oh my gosh, they got their heart broken in like fifth grade or some shit and they can't fucking like move on or whatever. So it did get me thinking that a lot of narcissistic abuse rhetoric is often similar and can be similar to incel rhetoric. Because if you blame the entire party, entirely, you never see your own flaws and you never see your own mistakes in that relationship. So you can describe narcissists as difficult to be in a relationship with, and I can fill in those blanks on my own based on my own personal experiences with women and whatnot. But I think the disconnect that a lot of people have is just a difference in labels, because you can say you don't like incels because they're entitled and blah, 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 and whatnot. And, they need to stop seeing things only from their lens. But when it comes to narcissistic abuse and these horrible relationships that people supposedly have had with narcissists, we never hear them talk about their own flaws, their own, distortions that could have contributed to making that relationship really difficult. And that is something that frustrates a lot of people about incels in particular, because, oh, they need to stop blaming women for everything. And a lot of people are supposedly, like mental health advocates and whatnot, but everybody's a bit tested on that when it comes to cluster B disorders and whatnot. Because kind of like what I said, in a way, how are you different than an incel by refusing to recognize how you might have made mistakes in that relationship, even with somebody that's a narcissist? Because if two people break up a relationship, which is the more like equal egalitarian approach to like, the entire thing, how are you not any different than the supposed narcissist that you're criticizing? Because narcissists as well supposedly cannot take accountability, cannot, see the wrong in their own actions. And if you only describe that towards the other person, the narcissist, then you don't acknowledge your own mistakes and flaws that could have contributed, a lot of discomfort and hurt that you can give somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder. You can give somebody with a cluster B disorder in general. So let me know if you think that's a false equivalency, because in a way, I don't really see the difference. It's just, a difference in like label and whatnot. You can say, oh, I hate incel men, and it's completely justified because these incel men are, oh, this or that. They're so entitled. They don't care about like anybody else, and it's justified. But when it comes to somebody with like narcissistic personality disorder, for example, everything that they did was only wrong towards you. So that's kind of funny for a lot of people that like to think that they're well-rounded, like individuals and whatnot, and have nothing blocking them. It almost sounds like you think you're better, greater, maybe even narcissistic, and you're looking in the same mirror of everything that you're criticizing. You'll hear a lot of people say that birds of the same feather, flock together. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because as the term narcissistic abuse goes, I've seen discussions that people might have about the validity of the term narcissistic abuse itself. And I never really weighed in on it in any of my videos, I believe. So I'm gonna do that right now. One thing that you'll often hear from people criticizing narcissists is that our, victim mentality is apparently really insufferable. But in contrast to the people who defend, the non-validity of narcissistic abuse being like an actual term, this is where you might see a lot of connection actually between the ex that you hate so much and yourself, and with the, you know, scapegoat of a stigmatized personality disorder, you can feel better by just calling it like, narcissistic abuse and whatnot. Because, the defenders of narcissistic abuse not being a valid term will say something like, oh, you wouldn't hear anything like autistic abuse, for example. So why exactly is it that narcissistic abuse is, a term special in and of itself? And you'll hear these people talk about how, oh, we've noticed like certain patterns. So there's something special about like narcissistic abuse compared to like, oh, abuse in general. But it does raise some questions, and it does make me, like raise my eyebrow a bit to, oh, you don't like narcissists so much because of their, oh, insufferable sort of like victim mentality. But maybe defending the notion that narcissistic abuse is like, this sort of like specialized form of an abuse, it almost sounds like a cover up from you just saying that, oh, I am such a strong, hard victim, because you'll never say that about any other disorder, but you have narcissistic abuse conveniently, and how it's so strategic, how it's so, like specialized in the form of like NPD. And because you have, a traumatic relationship with your ex, oh, it's really, really personal. So that justifies you being the biggest sorts of victim that there is. The same thing that, kind of like what I said, you don't like narcissists for. And the fact that you were in a relationship with this person might actually explain more similarity that, both of you have more than you're willing to admit, because there's always a disconnect when it comes to, like narcissistic people and whatnot, and getting in relationships with like, people like us. But if you truly claim to like love us when you get in these like relationships with us, and I know people are going to doubt whether or not like narcissists can actually like love other people, but if you say that you're capable of love and you're like so above like a narcissist, it's hilarious to me that this term is so defended specifically, especially towards a person that you once claimed you, really, really loved before all they were in your eyes was a big bad wolf narcissist. It's just food for thought. And here's the thing, you can't truly villainize someone that you claim to have really loved at one point, because it would be hypocritical to criticize incels in the same way of saying that, oh, they hate women, but they want women, and that doesn't make any sense. So they shield their pain and their rejection by hating women, despite the fact that they desire women so much. That is why they're involuntary celibate in the first place. Because admittedly, a lot of these things, when it comes to the people that, talk about like narcissistic abuse, and I actually have seen the connection between narcissists and incels, or, at the very least, people who are obviously going to be regarded as thinking like very strong ideologies are going to be connected to the people with the disorders that contain, antisocial tendencies and whatnot. So sure, okay, I get it, even if it's going to be at like the most like shallow point of it. But here's what I want to point out. Think of a situation where a guy, tries to impress a girl and it doesn't work out, and then suddenly he does a flip 180 switch, and he's like, oh, I actually don't like you, you're the worst, blah, 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 blah. And then you're just confused in your own head because you don't understand how that person could just switch all of a sudden, that incel could just switch all of a sudden when they really wanted to be with that person. So in actuality, that's a narcissistic defense just as much as, what somebody that often talks about like narcissistic abuse will actually engage in. and they don't see their hypocrisy, and they don't realize how, like, I guess let's just like, like being forward with it, how like one-sided they're truly being, which they really claim to hate narcissists for. Oh, narcissists being, quote unquote, so like arrogant and, like full of themselves and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of people attack narcissists, as I've said, for not being able to love and whatnot. And because they attack narcissists, they find it difficult to give sympathy to somebody who struggles with object constancy. And with all the things that I pointed out, if you have object constancy, and again, there was once a point in time where you really cared about this person, you really cared about, like, this narcissist, the fact that you would like villainize us so hard is telling about something. And I'm not trying to say that a narcissist or a cluster B person is, off the hook for any kind of like wrong behavior that we may or may not do. But the separation of us being human to you is, I guess, what I wanted to point out, like, in this video. If love is supposedly the strongest feeling that a person can experience and desire, and about me with my lack of object constancy in combination, I don't think that means I desire connection less. It just makes me a terrible executioner at it. And if you walked a moment in my shoes, I don't know if you'd keep trying or just give up completely. So